50 years ago, my home country of Ireland was one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. Farmers, priests, and emigration. That was the story. But today, it's one of the richest countries on earth, with GDP per capita higher than Germany, France, and even the UK. So what changed? It wasn't luck, it was philosophy. A change in how the country saw work, trade, and human freedom. So the story of how Ireland got rich and what it means for you. Now, this all happened during what was known as the Celtic Tiger period. I grew up in that period. In fact, when I was born, that was the worst time just about. And pretty much at that time, everything turned around. Since that time, everything started to go uphill, if you will. So that was in the mid-1980s when we implemented very smart government policies. Of course, there were a few ones over the prior few decades that were sort of slow, but really everything took off as we got into the 1990s. So it was rapid, and we rapidly caught up with a lot of the other Western European nations in just less than 20 years. Now, for much of the 20th century, Ireland was stagnant, right? It was backwards. The economy was closed. It was a lot of protectionism. In the 1930s, in particular around 1932, during the Great Depression in the US and elsewhere, we actually had a saying. We put tariffs on British products, and we said, burn everything British except their coal. So it was pretty protectionist. It was pretty backwards. And it was heavily state-controlled. Young people left in droves. I mean, this was just the way. That's why you've got so many Irish Americans. I wonder why. A lot of emigration. It was always net emigration. More people leaving than coming in. So by the 1980s, when I was born, unemployment was over 17%, and debt was over 100% of gross domestic product, GDP. But then something radical happened. Instead of blaming the system, Ireland changes. So freedom creates prosperity. That's the biggest takeaway I got from the Irish economic miracle, the Celtic Tiger. So in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s, Ireland made a moral and economic pivot. Taxes were cut dramatically. The corporate tax was cut down to about 10%. It has come up ever since to about 12.5%, but still, it's way lower than the European average of around 20%. And of course, way lower and 30% in some places, and way lower than what the US used to be, around 40%. So trade barriers fell. Foreign investment was welcomed, not feared. Education focused on skills, not slogans. The government stopped trying to manage, if you will, the economy and started letting people build it. The shift, right, that whole shift from control to freedom, that was what turned Ireland into what some call the Celtic Tiger. The real lesson isn't about tax rates. It's about trust in people, in markets, and in the idea that prosperity comes from human creativity, not bureaucracy. There was an envy around the time before this, and there was this thing about, oh, that person's working. We had to gradually shift away. It was almost like shifting away from almost the anti-British sentiment that pervaded a lot of the early part of the 20th century. It's a gradual improvement, but we did improve. And it took, again, it took the best part of 3/4 of a century to basically get there. So huge improvement, but again, it really comes down to that whole thing about freedom, creating prosperity. And that was what was really super unique about the Irish case. You know, there were like differences, of course, in the 70s, but by the 80s and 90s, bringing all that in, the Irish financial services sector, the IFSC, having that in the late 80s, right, that just changed it. Now we are Silicon Docks. Like Silicon Valley, we are Silicon Docks is the actual expression for Dublin, the main hub. Yes, it was quite centralized location-wise, but we brought in so many companies that we have like usually 24, 25 of the top 25 in most industries. If you look in the finance, you know, aircraft leasing, pharmaceutical giants, tech, you can name a company, it's probably they'll have an office in Dublin, in Ireland. And especially even after Brexit, right, after the UK left the European Union, there was even more of a pull towards Dublin as the last English-speaking nation and one of the lowest taxes for corporates and in the world. And we might like to bash that as much as we can, but if we didn't have those corporates, where would the jobs be? Governments do not create jobs, they merely redistribute existing amounts of money. Whereas the actual corporates, the innovation, the entrepreneurship, that's what really was flourishing from the late 1980s onwards. Economists love to talk about policy, but behind every policy is a philosophy of man. And I don't think that you quite get that. I have been on both sides. I've been an academic looking at policy, but I've also been an entrepreneur. And I find that those that have no experience with entrepreneurship are more cramming down policy. And doesn't matter how intelligent they are, how senior they are, if they have little to no experience themselves of actually running their own companies and hiring people, they shouldn't. It's like a pianist that has never played piano telling others how to play the piano, right? It's like that. So it's something I've experienced over time, is just and not to bash them too much, but just the innocence they have, the naivete of not having actually run a business, not having engaged people, and then trying to talk about it. It's like I've met people in finance like that. They were trying to tell people how to trade options, and they'd never traded options in their lives, right? So it's the same in economic policy as well. People who've never run businesses, never run companies, never employed a single individual, yet they're, talking about policy. So Ireland, their success came from rediscovering a truth older than economics, right? That work has dignity, freedom creates accountability, and moral responsibility makes wealth sustainable. So again, when you have experience and you have worked and you have done both sides, you kind of graduate. Like you can stick around with policy and academia to a certain extent, but until you actually hire people and you really engage the private sector, you don't have that much experience at the end of the day. You can study the data, you can write papers, you can study, but you haven't graduated to the next level, so to speak. So when people were free to trade, when you examine it, and you go on both sides, when you're free to trade, when you're free to invest, and when you're free to build, and when you have to bear the consequences of failure, then you get serious about excellence, because that's the only way to thrive. Incentives replaced ideology. Faith and enterprise started working together. And that's why, even with its flaws, Ireland became a hub for tech, for finance, and for innovation. It wasn't socialism, it was stewardship. This is the key distinction I find that is often missing. So now today, Ireland faces a new challenge, that temptation to drift back towards dependency, high spending, moral relativism, corporate capture. The question is, can it stay free without losing its soul? Because capitalism without character eventually collapses under its own success. It's a victim of its own success, if you will. And the Celtic Tiger, it made Ireland rich, but only virtue will keep it that way. Now, the Irish story, it isn't just about a country. It's about you. Because every person faces the same choice that nations do. Will you live by envy like Ireland did and control? Or by freedom and responsibility, which is where it kind of went from the late 80s onwards. That path to prosperity always starts the same way. Belief in work. Build something of value. Trust that virtue compounds faster than money. It really does, because the moment you take ownership, that's when your life starts to grow. If you're in sports, same thing. You own it, you'll be successful. Ireland didn't get rich by accident. It got rich by rediscovering truth. Freedom works, but only when paired with moral responsibility. And that's the real lesson for every nation and every person. Capitalism doesn't need fixing. We do.